3,000 years ago, a dramatic shift changed the course of Japanese history. An entire population arrived on the Japanese islands, bringing with them rice farming, new technologies, and their genetic legacy. But the scientists who studied their remains never expected to find that Korea held the key to understanding who the Japanese really are. What they discovered next would rewrite textbooks and reshape our understanding of East Asian population history. For generations, scientists have puzzled over a simple yet profound question. Where did the Japanese people come from? The answer seemed straightforward on the surface. Ancient Japan had been home to the Jōmon people, hunter-gatherers who thrived in the archipelago for thousands of years, developing sophisticated maritime adaptation strategies and creating distinctive cultures perfectly suited to their island environment. Their pottery with rope pattern markings became the defining symbol of an entire era. Then, around 3,000 years ago, something extraordinary changed. Migrants from continental Asia arrived on the islands, bringing revolutionary technologies and agricultural practices that would transform the entire region. These newcomers, known as the Yayoi people, eventually mixed with the indigenous Jōmon population, creating the genetic foundation of modern Japanese society. But understanding the precise origins of these Yayoi migrants, their exact homeland, and how they integrated with local populations remained one of the great mysteries of East Asian history. Were they from northern China, from the Korean Peninsula, from multiple sources combining different populations? The debate consumed academic research for decades. For decades, researchers debated competing theories with genuine passion rooted in archaeological and anthropological evidence. Some scientists proposed a two-way admixture model, suggesting that the primary source of immigration remained consistent throughout both the Yayoi and Kofun periods, with populations from the same geographical region arriving over time in successive waves. Others championed a more complex three-way model, arguing that two distinctly different populations arrived at different times, bringing separate genetic ancestries with them from separate source regions. This debate consumed academic conferences and filled scholarly journals with competing hypotheses, evidence, and counterarguments. The problem was simple but frustrating. There simply weren't enough high-quality ancient genomes to settle the argument definitively. Researchers had studied bones and artifacts extensively, cataloging pottery styles and tool types with meticulous precision, but ancient DNA from the Yayoi period remained scarce and difficult to extract successfully. Then came October 2024, and everything changed dramatically. A joint research group led by Jonghyun Kim and Juno Hashi at the University of Tokyo announced findings that would settle years of scientific debate with remarkable clarity and statistical support. They had successfully sequenced the complete nuclear genome of an individual from the Yayoi period, recovered from the Doigahama site in Yamaguchi Prefecture. This wasn't just another ancient skeleton in a laboratory warehouse. This individual, whose remains dated back approximately 2,300 years, carried genetic information that would illuminate the hidden history of an entire civilization and reshape scientific understanding of East Asian populations forever. The researchers approached this analysis with meticulous precision and scientific rigor that reflected their expertise in molecular genetics. They compared the genome of this Yayoi individual with ancient and modern populations across East Asia and Northeast Asia, creating a comprehensive comparative framework that would be statistically robust. They ran sophisticated admixture modeling, principal component analysis, and multiple statistical tests to understand exactly which populations most closely match this ancient person's genetic profile. The results were striking and unambiguous beyond any reasonable doubt. Among all non-Japanese populations examined, the modern Korean population showed the highest degree of genetic similarity to this Yayoi individual. This wasn't a minor connection or a marginal similarity, suggesting loose geographical relationship. The genetic affinity was substantial, unmistakable, and statistically significant. But what made this discovery truly revolutionary was what it revealed about the genetic structure itself and how ancestry components combined. The ancient Yayoi individual, like modern Koreans, possessed both East Asian-related and Northeastern Siberian-related ancestries in measurable proportions. This genetic combination was specific and identifiable, not random or ambiguous. When the researchers applied their admixture modeling to understand how these genetic components came together, the results consistently pointed toward a single, powerful conclusion. Between the Yayoi and Kofun periods, the majority of immigrants to the Japanese archipelago originated primarily from the Korean Peninsula. This wasn't an outlier or a questionable finding, but a robust result supported by multiple analytical approaches. This finding demolished the three-way admixture model that had dominated scientific thinking for years. That model had proposed two distinct migration waves bringing different genetic ancestries to Japan at different times. The new evidence didn't support this theory. Instead, the data overwhelmingly favored a two-way admixture model, one that posited a single primary source of immigration, the Korean Peninsula. Juno Hashi, the principal investigator, articulated the significance of this discovery with clear confidence. He stated that their results definitively showed that the three-way admixture model was incorrect. The evidence simply didn't support this older model that had guided research for so long. Understanding why this matters requires stepping back to examine the genetic landscape of East Asia more broadly. Modern Japanese people carry a complex genetic heritage comprising three distinct ancestral components that interweave throughout their genomes. The first comes from the Jōmon people, the original inhabitants of the Japanese archipelago who had thrived there for thousands of years before the Yayoi arrived, adapting perfectly to island life through maritime skills. The second component is East Asian-related ancestry, which connects them to populations in mainland China and similar regions, representing broader continental heritage. The third is Northeastern Siberian-related ancestry, which links them to populations in the far northeast of Asia and reflects additional continental connections. For decades, scientists understood that these three components existed within the modern Japanese genome, but explaining how they arrived and in what sequence remained frustratingly unclear. The Yayoi immigrants brought the Northeast Asian and East Asian genetic components with them when they migrated to the islands. They possessed sophisticated agricultural knowledge, particularly expertise in rice farming and paddy field construction, which would become the foundation of Japanese civilization and remain central to Japanese culture for millennia. They introduced new pottery techniques refined over generations in continental Asia, new tools designed specifically for agricultural work, and new ways of living organized around settled farming communities. Most importantly, they brought their genes, which would blend with the existing Jōmon population through centuries of intermarriage and cultural integration. The Kofun period, which followed the Yayoi, saw continued population movement from the continent to the archipelago, further reinforcing and expanding this genetic heritage. Each successive generation created new bonds between the populations through marriage and kinship networks. The path these migrants took is equally fascinating from both historical and genetic perspectives. Archaeological and genetic evidence suggests that rice and agricultural technology didn't simply appear in Japan spontaneously as an independent invention. Instead, farming practices spread from the Shandong Peninsula in northeastern China through the Liaodong Peninsula in the Ai, northwestern part of the Korean Peninsula, and then crossed into the Japanese archipelago via the Korean Peninsula itself. This route wasn't arbitrary or random. The genetic data shows clear patterns of how populations moved and settled, with researchers observing that the strength of shared genetic drift between Yayoi individuals and Jōmon populations correlated significantly with geographical distance from migration origins. In other words, Jōmon people living closer to Yayoi settlement sites show stronger genetic connections to the Yayoi, while those farther away show weaker connections. This pattern precisely matches what scientists would expect if migration and admixture occurred from the Korean Peninsula into southern Japan first, then gradually spread northward and eastward across the archipelago over generations. The discovery of Korean genetic connections in ancient Japanese populations wasn't entirely surprising to experts familiar with recent genetic research. Korean populations themselves exhibit a complex genetic structure reflecting their own historical migration patterns and admixture events. Modern Koreans carry substantial Northeastern Eurasian-related and East Asian-related genetic components, consistent with their own population history. But the research yielded an additional revelation that surprised many scientists working in this field. When researchers examined ancient Korean genomes from the Three Kingdoms period, approximately 1,700 years ago, they discovered something unexpected. Ancient Korea showed significantly more genetic diversity than modern Korea does today. 8 individuals from the Gaia region during the Three Kingdoms period, living between approximately 57 BC and 668 AD, revealed a fascinating pattern in their genetic makeup. 6 of these ancient Koreans clustered genetically with modern Koreans, modern Japanese, and Kofun period Japanese individuals. They also showed connections to Neolithic Korean populations, suggesting deep historical continuity. However, 2 of these ancient individuals exhibited genetic profiles that were slightly closer to modern Japanese and ancient Jōmon populations, indicating different migration histories. This meant that ancient Korea, particularly during the Three Kingdoms period when Korean ethnicity and culture were still crystallizing, contained genetic diversity that would eventually disappear from the Korean population. Modern Koreans, by contrast, show a much more homogeneous genetic profile lacking this earlier diversity. Researchers hypothesized that this change resulted from relative genetic isolation that followed the Three Kingdoms period. As the Korean Peninsula unified politically and culturally under new kingdoms, population movement slowed, and the genetic diversity from earlier eras gradually diluted through random genetic drift and population consolidation. The Jōmon-related genetic component that existed in ancient Korea essentially disappeared from the modern Korean population over subsequent centuries. This tells a story of population history as dynamic and fluid as the historical and political changes that shaped East Asia. The significance of this genetic research extends far beyond academic interest in historical populations. These findings illuminate fundamental questions about human migration, adaptation, and cultural development throughout human history. Around 3,000 years ago, the world experienced major shifts in human civilization affecting every continent. In some regions, people were transitioning from hunter-gatherer lifestyles to agricultural societies, a transformation with profound consequences for social organization and population growth. This transition didn't happen independently in every location through parallel invention. Instead, it often involved population movement, with agricultural peoples migrating into territories occupied by hunter-gatherers, followed by admixture and cultural integration over centuries. The Japanese archipelago represents one of the most thoroughly documented examples of this transition in the entire world, with both archaeological and genetic evidence combining to create a comprehensive historical picture. The Jōmon people who inhabited the Japanese islands for thousands of years before the Yayoi arrival had developed a sophisticated hunter-gatherer culture adapted to island living. They created distinctive pottery with rope pattern markings that remain iconic even today, gave their name to an entire era that lasted for millennia, and established settlements across the archipelago. They understood their environment intimately, exploiting both marine and terrestrial resources to sustain their populations year-round with deep ecological knowledge. Yet when the Yayoi arrived with agricultural technology, particularly wet rice farming, and the infrastructure it required, a gradual but profound transformation began. Agriculture could support much larger populations than hunting and gathering, enabling population growth and social complexity. Rice farming required organized labor, permanent settlements with substantial investments in infrastructure, and stored surpluses for seasonal survival. It changed social structures, enabled population growth that exceeded what gathering could support, and created new forms of political organization and hierarchy that fundamentally altered Japanese society. The genetic evidence shows this wasn't a story of simple replacement, where one population eliminated another through warfare or disease. Instead, it was a story of admixture, integration, and cultural transformation. Yayoi migrants settled particularly in western and central Japan initially, and intermarried with Jōmon women and men, creating mixed families with both cultural heritages. Over generations and centuries, the populations blended, though the Yayoi genetic contribution became dominant in most regions due to the larger immigrant population. The Jōmon genetic heritage didn't disappear. It remains visible in modern Japanese genomes, particularly in certain regions where Jōmon ancestry is proportionally higher. In Hokkaido, the indigenous Ainu people retain particularly high levels of Jōmon-related ancestry, representing a distinct genetic legacy of that ancient population. The research methodology behind these discoveries demonstrates how modern molecular genetics has revolutionized our understanding of human history and population origins. To sequence an ancient genome, researchers must recover usable DNA from remains thousands of years old. This is no trivial task requiring specialized expertise. Ancient DNA degrades over time, becoming fragmented and contaminated with environmental DNA from bacteria and fungi that colonized bones after death. Scientists must extract minute amounts of genuine ancient DNA from bone or teeth, sometimes amplifying just a few nanograms of material, into complete genomic sequences through advanced amplification techniques. They use specialized bioinformatic techniques to identify which DNA fragments truly originated from the ancient individual, and which represent contamination or degradation artifacts from the soil environment. The researchers examining the Yayoi individual from Doigahama employed cutting-edge sequencing technology to generate a complete nuclear genome, with high quality and coverage that enabled robust analysis. They didn't merely sequence this one individual in isolation. Instead, they created a comprehensive comparative analysis, positioning this ancient Yayoi genome within a broader dataset of modern and ancient populations from across East Asia. They examined genetic variation patterns, identified ancestry components using specialized statistical software, and tested competing models against the data using admixture modeling approaches. When they asked which living population most closely matched this ancient Yayoi individual genetically, the answer was unambiguous: modern Koreans. The implications of this finding for understanding East Asian population history are profound and far-reaching. It establishes beyond reasonable doubt that the Korean Peninsula served as the primary gateway for continental Asian populations, moving into the Japanese archipelago during their crucial Yayoi and Kofun periods. It also suggests that the populations of Korea and Japan have been genetically connected for at least 2,000 years, with ongoing gene flow between them across multiple centuries. Modern genetic differences between core Eons and Japanese populations presumably accumulated over subsequent millennia through genetic drift, natural selection, and continued but limited population interaction. Looking forward, researchers acknowledge that much work remains to be done to fully understand this complex history. The next goal is to examine genomes from more Yayoi individuals to clarify why more than 80% of the genomic components of the modern Japanese population derive from immigration. Researchers want to understand in greater detail how the admixture between continental Asian and indigenous Jōmon people progressed across the Japanese archipelago. Did the admixture occur rapidly in some regions and slowly in others? Did admixture patterns differ between coastal and inland areas? How did social structures and cultural practices affect intermarriage between Yayoi and Jōmon populations? These questions point toward a future of even more granular research, uncovering regional and temporal variation in this crucial transition. With continued discoveries of ancient Japanese genomes, scientists will construct increasingly detailed models of population history. They will potentially identify individual migration events, trace specific populations across regions, and understand the social and cultural processes that accompany genetic admixture. Ancient DNA research combined with archaeological data can illuminate how new technologies like rice farming spread across regions, how social hierarchies developed, and how cultural practices evolved during periods of population contact. The broader context of this research includes similar genetic discoveries worldwide that have transformed our understanding of human history. In Europe, ancient DNA studies revealed that Indo-European languages were brought by steppe pastoralists who migrated westward. In the Americas, ancient genomes show that humans populated the continents through multiple migration waves. The research also highlights how scientific understanding evolves over time. Earlier genetic studies, conducted with more limited data and less sophisticated analytical techniques, had supported the three-way admixture model. As technology improved and more ancient genomes became available, evidence accumulated challenging this model. Science is not static, but dynamic, with new evidence potentially overturning previous consensus. This particular transition demonstrates how scientific knowledge progresses through careful examination of accumulating evidence and rigorous testing of competing hypotheses against real data. For the general public, these discoveries might prompt reflection on national identity and genetic heritage. Koreans and Japanese are distinct nations with separate languages, cultures, and political histories, yet genetically they share a common heritage stretching back thousands of years. The Yayoi migrants who brought agriculture to the Japanese archipelago originated from the Korean Peninsula. Without that migration, without that genetic admixture, without that cultural exchange, Japanese civilization might have developed along a fundamentally different trajectory. The research underscores how genetic relationships don't determine cultural identity, but rather illuminate the deep connections underlying human diversity and civilization. The study published in the Journal of Human Genetics in October 2024 represents a watershed moment in East Asian genetic research. The team sequencing the Yayoi individual included researchers from multiple institutions, bringing diverse expertise. This multi-institutional collaboration brought together molecular genetics specialists, population geneticists, archaeological experts, and population anthropologists. The combination of these perspectives strengthened the research and ensured rigorous interpretation of the genetic data from every angle possible. Since this publication, interest in ancient Japanese and Korean genetics has intensified among the scientific community. Additional research teams have embarked on their own ancient genome projects, seeking to sequence additional Yayoi individuals from different regions of Japan. They recognize that while the Doigahama individual provides crucial insights, a single genome represents just one person from one location at one time. To fully understand Yayoi population history requires sampling across space and time, examining individuals from different regions and different temporal periods within the Yayoi era to understand regional and temporal variation in genetic patterns and migration timing. These genetic discoveries tell a story of human movement, adaptation, and cultural development spanning thousands of years. When Yayoi migrants from the Korean Peninsula arrived in the Japanese archipelago, approximately 3,000 years ago, they brought not merely their genes, but their knowledge, skills, languages, and cultures. They encountered indigenous Jōmon populations who had thrived in those islands for millennia with sophisticated cultures and deep connections to their environment. What followed was a gradual process of cultural and genetic integration that transformed both populations. Neither population simply disappeared. Instead, they merged over generations and centuries, creating something entirely new. The genetic and cultural synthesis that resulted laid the foundation for Japanese civilization as it developed into one of the world's great civilizations. Today, modern Japanese people carry that legacy in their genomes, visible in the three-component genetic structure that characterizes their population. They also carry it in their languages, which show influences from multiple linguistic sources. They carry it in their cultural practices, which blend indigenous and continental Asian traditions. They carry it in their history, which acknowledges both the Jōmon and Yayoi as foundational to Japanese identity and civilizational development. The ancient DNA evidence confirming the Korean Peninsula origins of the Yayoi migrants doesn't diminish Japanese cultural distinctiveness or national identity. Rather, it enriches understanding of how that identity developed through complex historical and biological processes spanning millennia. This is ultimately what makes ancient genetic research so compelling to scientists and the general public alike. It reveals the hidden history written in our biology, the stories of human migration and admixture that shaped who we are today. It demonstrates that modern populations are never genetically pure or historically isolated, but rather represent the accumulated genetic legacy of migrations, encounters, and admixtures accumulated across thousands of years. The discovery that modern Japanese genetic ancestry connects directly to the Korean Peninsula through the Yayoi migrants exemplifies how genetic research illuminates these deep historical connections that transcend modern political and cultural boundaries. It invites us to contemplate our own genetic heritage and the complex histories embedded within our genomes, waiting to be discovered through the advances of modern science.